Bandicoot Retrospective. Press start to begin.
The year is 2003, and on the same day that Crash Nitro Kart was released on consoles, we also got a Game Boy Advance port of the game as well. I was going back and forth on whether or not I would go over handheld ports of these Crash games, but I just had to see how this would work on a Game Boy Advance. It's not like the Game Boy Advance was capable of that many 3D graphics. Will Crash Nitro Kart on Game Boy Advance be a contender with its console counterpart, or will its handheld nature bog down the experience? Let's find out. The story of Crash Nitro Kart on the GBA is the exact same as the console version, but in case you didn't see that video, I'm not gonna pretend to be out of breath. You know I sped it up in post. Or did I? Phew! I'm going to knock off one letter grade for the story, however. Not because the cutscenes are now just PowerPoint presentations. I don't expect there to be fully 3D cutscenes on a Game Boy Advance. They did water it down a bit though, especially in the boss character department. For example, Geary in the console version is a robot who has an obsessive compulsion to clean every speck of dust around. In this game, he's just a robot. No personality whatsoever in any of the cutscenes he's in. I'm also pretty sure the people who did the text for this game didn't realize that Velo is saying circuits, not circus, when talking about the races. With all of that in mind, Crash Nitro Kart on the GBA's story gets my rating of an A. The gameplay of this game is exactly what you'd expect out of a Game Boy Advance kart racer. Even the structure of the game is the same as the console port. You must get first place in all of the courses to get the trophies, then fight the boss who has an item that they infinitely spawn behind them to make it more difficult for you to catch up. Do this until you race and beat Velo, and you win. You even still have the same style of kart racer too. You drive the kart along the course, collecting items to use against your opponents along the way. Being a handheld game on the Game Boy Advance, however, you can definitely tell they had to cut a lot of corners and cope with a lot of difficulties. For one thing, the control is fine for the most part, but drifting is a nightmare. Every time you go to drift in this game, you damn well near turn 90 degrees on a dime. Due to this, I didn't use the drift really much at all, and not only was I able to get all of the trophies like this, I was able to get all of the relics like this with little to no resistance from the game. It's almost as if the devs knew the controls were a little worse and loosened up the times a bit to compensate. That leads me into the difficulty of this game. This game is way too easy. Being a Game Boy Advance game, they couldn't really do true 3D with dynamic tracks and ramps and what have you like they did with the console port. Instead, they flattened all of the courses out into Super Mario Kart-esque stages and just did that for the whole game. It makes the courses too easy and makes getting through the game feel more like a list of chores than it does overcoming any sort of challenge. It's funny. The console version overshot, and the handheld version undershot. Lastly, and I'll go over this more when I get to the presentation portion since it concerns that too, sometimes it's really hard to tell what's a part of the track and what's not. I've driven into walls and corners a good amount of times because I legit couldn't tell which way the course was trying to get me to go. All in all, it wasn't a terrible experience, just sort of felt like going through the motions. With all of that in mind, Crash Nitro Kart on the GBA's gameplay gets my rating of a B-. This game looks iffy. Don't get me wrong, I commend them for their efforts. They tried to recreate every single track from the console game in this game, being limited by the capabilities of the Game Boy Advance. Credit where credit is due, some of these backgrounds look amazing. It's how these tracks work in gameplay that really screws things up a bit. With the way the track is laid out and the color choices they used for the tracks and the backgrounds, the way to go is very unclear sometimes. Like I said in the gameplay section, there were times where I bumped into walls and corners because I really was not sure where the track was going to lead me. In a racing game, this is very important to get right because crashing into a wall by accident could mean the loss of the race by no fault of your own. The track needs to be a bit more clear as to what direction they expected you to be going. Other than that, it's a faithful recreation of its console counterpart. One thing I really appreciate that this version of the game has over its console version is the minimap in the overworld. It may seem like such a small difference, but I navigated the hub world so much easier in this version than I did on the PS2. God, why did they get rid of the minimap? As for the music, I'm surprised. Instead of opting to just have MIDI versions of the console port soundtrack, they have an almost entirely original soundtrack. The only song they have in common is the main theme of the game. Weirdly enough, I like the soundtrack more. This game's songs are a lot more bumpin' and really accentuate the environments they were made for. Whereas the console port's music fades into the background, this game's music is right there in your face, hyping you up. If only the visual department kept up. One thing I have to criticize is the voice clips they put in this game. There aren't many, but oh my god, the amount of times I heard engines screaming in this game was absurd. I would get the occasional voice line from Crash and Coco, but engines was constant, my god. With all of that in mind, Crash Nitro Kart on the GBA's presentation gets my rating of a C+. To complete Crash Nitro Kart on the GBA, you pretty much have to do everything you did in the console port. Obtain all 12 trophies, all 16 CNK tokens, all 13 relics, and all 4 gems, then defeat Velo in a final race. Like I said, this game is not hard in the slightest. I actually got everything in the game without much of a problem at all. There are two major differences that make this completion experience different than its console port. The first bogs it down a lot. Just like Crash Bandicoot 2 Entrance, they made it necessary for you to get platinum relics in order to truly get 100%. This goes for both stories of the game. I completely opted out of this because why would I put myself through the torture? I got the relics, that's enough. The other difference which I highly appreciated and made this game a lot more completionist friendly was how they handled the gems. In the console port, to get the gems, you must get first place in a Grand Prix style gauntlet where you must do as well as you can for 4 races in a row while the AI's difficulty is cranked up to phenomena. This game does a similar approach, but this time, you only have to do 1 lap in each stage. What's interesting is that, technically, this makes getting the gems a teeny bit harder, since you don't have as much time to catch up to the other racers. But if you lose the gem circuit, you don't have to sit through 12 laps of racing again, just 4. I honestly like this method a lot more, and it makes getting the gems feel more quick and fair, while also being a little bit more of a challenge than the normal races. That being said though, completing this game will feel like completing a list of chores to do before racing Velo. But just know that if you decide to do so, it won't take you very long. Crash Nitro Kart on the GBA is pretty much exactly what you'd expect from hearing that title. With a diet version of the story, flattened and easy gameplay with slightly worse controls, a messy visual style with a surprisingly banging soundtrack, and a completion that is easy but not very rewarding, Crash Nitro Kart for the GBA is just a watered-down version of the console release. With all of that in mind, Crash Nitro Kart for the GBA gets my overall rating of a B. It's not absolutely insufferable as a game, but you'd have a better time playing the console port. Thank you everybody so much for watching this video, and if you like the Crash Retrospective, please like, comment, and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this one, and hit that bell so you don't miss the next episode. We also have merch in the description below where you can get our shirts, mugs, and stickers to enrich your gameplay experience. I'd like to give a special shout out to Andrew's Retro Games for being the most well-esteemed guest of them all. You could also become a channel member to get all of these videos when I'm finished editing them as opposed to when they're scheduled to come out. Next week, we'll be looking at the next Crash game in the lineup, Crash Bandicoot Purple Ripto's Rampage. With that, I'm Bottles, and I bid you, my well-esteemed guests, adieu.